Picture this. You wake up before dawn, not to the sound of an alarm clock, but to the crack of a whip. Your hands are already bleeding from yesterday's work, but there's no time to rest. You own nothing, not your home, not your tools, not even yourself. You are property, human property. This isn't ancient Rome, this isn't the American South, this is medieval Europe, and you are a serf. For over 1,000 years, millions of people lived and died as serfs, trapped in a system so brutal, so dehumanizing, that it makes slavery look merciful by comparison. Yet their stories have been forgotten, buried beneath tales of knights and nobles. Today, we uncover the horrifying truth about life as a serf in medieval Europe. The truth that historians don't want you to know. The reality that was darker than any dungeon, more terrifying than any torture chamber. This is the story of Europe's forgotten slaves. The year is 1066. William the Conqueror has just invaded England, but his conquest isn't just about land, it's about people. Human beings who, overnight, become property. But serfdom didn't begin with the Normans. It evolved from the ashes of the Roman Empire, a system designed to trap the poor and powerless. By the 11th century, nearly 90% of Europe's population were serfs. That's over 25 million human beings reduced to the status of livestock. Meet Godwin. He's not a character from a history book. He's a real person who lived in Yorkshire, England in 1086. We know about him because he appears in the Domesday Book, not as a citizen, but as an asset. Listed right between the cattle and the pigs. Godwin was born a serf, and according to the law, he would die a serf. His children would be serfs. His children's children would be serfs. There was no escape, no hope, no future beyond the boundaries of his lord's estate. But what exactly was a serf? The legal definition was simple and terrifying. A serf is a person who belongs to the land. They weren't technically slaves. They couldn't be bought and sold separately from the land they worked. But in practice, this distinction was meaningless. They were human property, owned body and soul by their feudal lords. Let's examine the legal status of serfs, because understanding their legal position reveals the true horror of their situation. Serfs had no legal rights. None. They couldn't own property, couldn't travel without permission, couldn't marry without their lord's consent, and couldn't even leave their lord's land without becoming fugitives. The law was crystal clear. Serfs are bound to the soil. This meant that if you were born on a lord's estate, you belonged to that estate forever. If the land was sold, you were sold with it. If the land was inherited, you were inherited along with the pigs and the plows. But it gets worse. Serfs couldn't even control their own bodies. Lords had the right to beat their serfs, to work them to death, to separate families at will. And if a serf somehow managed to save a few coins, the lord could confiscate them at any time, for any reason, or for no reason at all. Consider the case of Agnes the serf, documented in the court rolls of Ramsey Abbey in 1294. Agnes had saved enough money to buy a small plot of land. The moment her lord discovered this, he seized not only the money, but also imposed a fine of 6 shillings, nearly a year's wages, for attempting to act above her station. The legal system was designed to keep serfs trapped. If a serf fled and was caught, they faced brutal punishment. If they tried to defend themselves against an abusive lord, they were guilty of treason. If they complained about their treatment, they were guilty of insubordination. There was no court of appeal, no higher authority to turn to. The lord was judge, jury, and executioner. His word was law, and his cruelty was legal. Now let's follow a serf through a typical day. But I warn you, what you're about to hear will disturb you. It's 4 a.m. The church bells haven't even rung for morning prayers, but Godwin is already awake. He has to be. His lord's steward will be making rounds soon, and any serf found sleeping after dawn faces a beating. Godwin lives in a hovel. Calling it a house would be generous. It's a single room. maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, shared with his wife, 3 children, 2 pigs, and a handful of chickens. The floor is dirt. The roof leaks. There's no chimney, just a hole in the roof that lets out some of the smoke from the central fire pit. The smell is indescribable. Human waste, animal waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, and smoke create a toxic atmosphere that would make a modern person vomit. But Godwin has no choice. This is his world. He owns nothing in this hovel. The Lord owns the building, the furniture, even the cooking pot. If Godwin displeases his Lord, he can be evicted with nothing but the clothes on his back. Breakfast? There is no breakfast. Serfs ate twice a day if they were lucky, once at noon, once at sunset. And what they ate would horrify you. Bread made from barley mixed with sawdust, thin gruel, maybe some cabbage if they were fortunate. Meat was reserved for the Lord's table. By 5 a.m., Godwin is in the fields. And here's where the true horror of serfdom reveals itself. The work system. Serfs didn't just work on their lord's land, they worked for free. 3 days a week, minimum, sometimes more during harvest season. This was called labor service, but it was really unpaid slavery. But it gets worse. Serfs also had to work their own small plots to feed their families. When did they do this? At night, by moonlight, after finishing their unpaid labor for the Lord. They worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week, with no vacation, no sick leave, no retirement. And if they didn't work, the penalties were savage. Missing a day of labor service meant losing a week's food rations. Missing a week meant physical punishment, public flogging, confinement in the stocks, or worse. The work itself was backbreaking. Imagine plowing a field with a wooden plow pulled by oxen, if the Lord was generous enough to provide oxen. More often, serfs had to pull the plows themselves, like human beasts of burden. During harvest season, the work became even more brutal. Serfs worked from dawn to dusk, 7 days a week, racing against time to bring in the crops. And for all this labor, they kept maybe 20% of what they produced. The rest went to the Lord. The power feudal lords held over their serfs was absolute. To understand the true horror of serfdom, we need to examine just how complete this power was. Lords could beat their serfs at will. They could rape serf women without consequence. They could sell serf children to other lords. They could work their serfs to death, and the only legal requirement was to replace them with new serfs. Let me give you a specific example that will chill your blood. In 1278, the Lord of Cuxham village in England ordered his serfs to work through a plague outbreak. When the serfs protested that they were dying, the Lord's response was recorded in the manor court rolls. Dead serfs can be replaced. Unharvested grain cannot. 12 serfs died in the fields. Their bodies were left to rot while the survivors continued working around the corpses. But the Lord's power extended beyond physical abuse. They controlled every aspect of serf life through a system of fees and fines designed to keep serfs impoverished and dependent. Want to get married? Pay the Lord a fee called merchant. Want your son to inherit your tiny plot? Pay harriet, often the family's best animal or tool. Want to grind grain into flour? You could only use the Lord's mill and pay an extortionate fee for the privilege. These weren't optional fees. They were mandatory tributes that kept serfs trapped in poverty. The system was designed to ensure that no matter how hard a serf worked, they would never accumulate enough wealth to buy their freedom. Consider the case of Robert the Serf, documented in the court rolls of St. Albans Abbey. In 1381, Robert had saved enough money to buy his freedom, a process called manumission. But when he approached the abbot with his savings, he was told the price had doubled. When he finally saved enough again, 3 years later, the price had doubled again. Robert died a serf, despite working his entire life for freedom. This was the cruel genius of the feudal system. It dangled the possibility of freedom while making it virtually impossible to achieve. If life was hell for male serfs, it was even worse for women and children. Serf women faced all the hardships of male serfs, plus additional horrors that are difficult to discuss. Serf women were considered the sexual property of their lords. The practice of jus primae noctis, the rite of the first night, may be mythical, but the reality was worse. Lords could rape serf women at will, and there was no legal recourse. The children born from these rapes were automatically serfs, adding to their lords' human property. Serf women worked in the fields alongside men during the day, then returned home to cook, clean, tend children, and often spin thread or weave cloth for their lord. They worked while pregnant, gave birth in the fields, and returned to work within days of delivery. Pregnancy was especially dangerous for serf women. With no medical care and constant heavy labor, maternal mortality rates were catastrophic. Historical records suggest that over 30% of serf women died in childbirth or from complications soon after. But surviving childhood as a serf was equally challenging. Serf children began working at age 7, not playing but genuine labor. They tended animals, gathered fuel, helped with harvest, and performed countless other tasks that would be considered child abuse today. Education was forbidden. Teaching a serf child to read was a crime punishable by severe fines. Lords wanted their serfs ignorant and compliant, not educated and potentially rebellious. Child mortality among serfs was astronomical. Historical records from the 13th century suggest that 50% of serf children died before their 10th birthday. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, and brutal working conditions created a childhood that was more like a war zone than anything resembling normal development. The lucky ones died young. Those who survived faced a lifetime of bondage, knowing they would pass the same fate to their own children. You might wonder, why didn't serfs rebel? Why didn't they fight back against this system of oppression? The truth is, they did, constantly. But the punishments for resistance were so severe that most rebellion was crushed before it began. The most common form of resistance was running away. Despite the legal restrictions, thousands of serfs attempted to flee to towns and cities where they might find freedom. The law stated that if a serf could avoid capture for a year and a day, they would be legally free. But escape was nearly impossible. Lords employed professional serf hunters, men whose job was to track down and capture runaway serfs. These hunters used dogs, just like slave catchers in the American South centuries later. The punishment for captured runaways was savage: public flogging, branding, or, in extreme cases, death. When individual resistance failed, serfs sometimes resorted to collective action. The most famous serf rebellion was the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, led by Wat Tyler and John Ball. For a brief moment, it seemed like the serfs might break their chains. The rebels' demands were simple: end serfdom, reduce taxes, and grant basic human rights. Their battle cry was equally simple: when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? But the rebellion was crushed with characteristic medieval brutality. Wat Tyler was murdered during peace negotiations. John Ball was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Thousands of rebel serfs were executed, their heads displayed on spikes as warnings to others. The aftermath was even worse. Lords across England used the rebellion as an excuse to tighten their control. New laws made it even harder for serfs to escape, even more dangerous to resist. Other forms of resistance were equally dangerous. Refusing to work meant starvation. Attacking an overseer meant death. Even verbal complaints could result in brutal punishment. The court rolls are filled with examples of creative punishments designed to terrorize serfs into submission. Public humiliation in the stocks, ritual beatings, forced labor in chains, all were common responses to even minor infractions. Serfdom didn't end suddenly. It died slowly, agonizingly, over several centuries. But its death wasn't due to moral awakening or humanitarian concerns. It ended because it became economically inefficient. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 changed everything. When the plague killed 1/3 of Europe's population, including millions of serfs, the survivors found themselves in a position they'd never experienced. They were valuable. Suddenly, lords were competing for workers. Wages began to rise. Serfs began to demand better treatment, better food, better living conditions. Some lords, desperate for workers, began offering freedom in exchange for labor contracts. But the transition was neither quick nor peaceful. Many lords fought desperately to maintain the old system. They passed laws freezing wages, forbidding serfs from leaving their lords, and imposing harsh penalties on anyone who hired runaway serfs. The Statute of Laborers, passed in England in 1351, tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and bind workers to their lords. Similar laws were passed across Europe, but economic reality was stronger than legal fiction. The old system was dying, whether lords liked it or not. In Western Europe, serfdom largely ended by the 15th century. But in Eastern Europe, it actually got worse. Polish, Russian, and German lords imposed second serfdom, even harsher conditions than before. Russian serfdom didn't end until 1861, and some historians argue it simply transformed into other forms of bondage. The end of serfdom wasn't liberation. It was economic evolution. Many former serfs found themselves as wage laborers, sharecroppers, or urban poor. Freedom from serfdom didn't mean freedom from poverty or exploitation. Today, we remember medieval Europe as the age of knights and castles, of chivalry and romance. But this sanitized version of history ignores the suffering of millions. For every knight in shining armor, there were hundreds of serfs living in conditions that would be considered torture by modern standards. For every magnificent cathedral, there were thousands of hovels where families lived worse than animals. The wealth that built those castles and cathedrals was extracted from the unpaid labor of serfs. The leisure that allowed nobles to compose poetry and practice courtly love was purchased with the blood and sweat of bondsmen. Modern historians estimate that serfs produced 80% of medieval Europe's wealth while receiving less than 10% of it. The remaining 70% went to support a tiny aristocratic class that literally lived off the misery of others. Perhaps most tragically, the system was justified by the very institutions that preached love and compassion. The Catholic Church not only supported serfdom, but was often the harshest master of all. Church lands were worked by serfs, and church lords were often more brutal than secular ones. The Church taught that serfdom was God's will, that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. They turned oppression into religious doctrine, making resistance not just illegal, but sinful. This theological justification allowed the system to persist for centuries. Serfs were taught that their bondage was punishment for original sin, that questioning their status was questioning God Himself. The story of medieval serfs is more than ancient history. It's a reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty, but also of our capacity for endurance. For over 1,000 years, millions of human beings lived and died in bondage. They were bought and sold, worked to death, and forgotten by history. Their names don't appear in the chronicles of kings and queens. Their stories weren't recorded by court historians, but they were real. They had hopes and dreams, loves and losses, just like us. They felt pain when they were beaten, despair when their children died, and hope when they dreamed of freedom. Today, as we face our own challenges with inequality, exploitation, and human rights, we should remember the serfs of medieval Europe. Their suffering reminds us that progress is not inevitable, that human dignity must be constantly defended, and that the powerful will always find ways to exploit the powerless unless we remain vigilant. The serfs of medieval Europe were forgotten slaves, but they were not forgotten humans. In remembering their stories, in refusing to let their suffering disappear into historical amnesia, we honor their memory and perhaps learn something about ourselves. In the end, the greatest tragedy of serfdom wasn't just the physical suffering it caused, but the way it was accepted, normalized, and justified by an entire civilization. That's a lesson we can't afford to forget. The serfs of medieval Europe lived in darkness, but their stories can help illuminate the path toward a more just and humane world. They deserve to be remembered, not as statistics or economic units, but as human beings who endured the unendurable and somehow found ways to survive. This is their story. This is their memorial. This is why we must never forget Europe's forgotten slaves.